All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into some fascinating research on loneliness.
Yeah.
You sent over some really interesting articles from Everyday Health and Quant Magazine,
Yeah.
and even a dense scientific review from neuropsychopharmacology.
It is dense.
But it's fascinating stuff. We're going way beyond just a feeling this time.
Right.
We're going to uncover how loneliness actually rewires the brain
Yeah.
and what that means for all of us.
Absolutely. And it's a growing field of study.
Yeah.
Really amazing what we're learning about the brain's social wiring these days.
So let's start with something that might surprise some people listening.
Okay.
Is loneliness actually a biological drive, like hunger?
It really seems that way. You see, for our ancestors, being part of a group meant survival protection from predators. Finding food easier, help with raising children. It all depended on those strong social bonds.
That makes sense, but how does that translate to our brains today?
Well, researchers have actually visualized this.
Really?
Yeah, there's this fascinating study where they used fMRI scans to look at people's brains after they've been fasting for hours.
Okay.
Then they showed them pictures of delicious food.
Oh, I can imagine those brains lit up.
Yeah, cravings galore.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting part. They did a similar experiment with people who were experiencing loneliness. Only this time they showed them pictures of friends socializing, having fun together.
Their brains lit up too.
Yes. And the activity patterns were strikingly similar to the hunger response.
Wow.
Yeah. It suggests that our brains crave social connection in a very real, primal way.
So it's not just a modern day phenomenon.
No.
This is literally wired into us.
Yeah, it's deep stuff.
Wow. Okay, so we are wired for connection. But, and this is a big but, that doesn't mean we always feel connected.
Right.
In fact, more and more people are saying they feel lonely these days.
Exactly. And the irony is that deep craving for connection can actually make it harder to form those bonds.
Wait, hold on. Explain that to me.
Okay.
How can wanting connection make it harder to connect?
Right. So think about it like this. If our ancestors were rejected from the group, it could have been a death sentence.
Yeah.
So their brains became very finely tuned to pick up on any hint of a social threat, any sign of rejection.
So we're wired to be extra sensitive to those social cues.
Exactly.
How does that play out today?
Well, studies have shown that people who feel lonely are much quicker to pick up on negative social cues.
Like what?
Like a slight frown or a disinterested tone of voice.
Oh, really?
We're talking milliseconds faster than others.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So even if someone isn't intentionally trying to be off-putting, a lonely person might perceive it that way.
Precisely. And that brings us to something called negative bias.
Negative bias.
Which basically means that your brain starts looking for evidence to confirm your fears.
Oh, so if you're already feeling lonely, you're primed to interpret ambiguous social interactions as rejection.
Exactly.
Even if they weren't intended that way.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. The lonelier you feel, the more your brain misinterprets those social cues.
Yeah.
Leading to more feelings of loneliness and so on.
And unfortunately, it doesn't end there.
Oh, no.
This chronic loneliness, this feeling of social isolation, it doesn't just impact our thoughts and behaviors. It affects the physical structure of our brains as well.
You're kidding. Loneliness can actually change our brains. We are really going deep here. Okay, tell me more about these changes.
And so let's start with brain volume. Because multiple studies have found that chronic loneliness is linked to reduced gray matter volume in certain brain regions.
And remind me, gray matter? That's where all the important brain cells hang out, right?
That's right. It's where the neurons live and make all those essential connections.
So less gray matter means fewer brain cells.
Yeah, and that's not ideal.
That can't be good.
No. And the areas affected are particularly concerning.
Like what?
One of them is the prefrontal cortex, that executive center of the brain, involved in decision-making, planning, and even social behavior.
So loneliness can actually shrink the part of our brain responsible for socializing. It's like our brains are working against us on multiple levels here.
Yeah, it's a bit like that, unfortunately. And it gets worse.
Oh, what else?
Remember that protein we talked about earlier? BDNF. Crucial for brain cell growth and survival.
Yes, like fertilizer for the brain.
Exactly. Well, loneliness appears to reduce BDNF levels, which could explain those decreases in gray matter volume. It's like chronic loneliness deprives the brain of the nourishment it needs to thrive.
Wow, okay, I'm starting to see why this is such a big deal. And this research mentioned something about Alzheimer's disease, too.
It did.
What's the connection there?
Right. That's one of the more recent and concerning findings.
Okay.
It seems that loneliness may increase the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease.
Seriously? How so?
Loneliness seems to be correlated with a buildup of amyloid and tau proteins in the brain, the hallmarks of Alzheimer's. These proteins clump together, forming plaques and tangles that disrupt brain cell communication.
So feeling lonely isn't just bad for our mental well-being.
Right.
It impacts our brain health on a physical level.
That's the reality, unfortunately. But the good news is that the brain is incredibly adaptable.
Okay. Thank you.
It can change and rewire itself throughout life, a concept called neuroplasticity.
So there's hope.
There is.
But if simply being more social isn't a magical solution,
right,
what can we actually do to combat these negative effects of loneliness? I know the research mentioned some promising interventions.
It did. And a lot of it boils down to addressing that negative bias we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Therapy, for example, can help people reframe those automatic negative thoughts and learn to interpret social cues in a more balanced way.
So it's about teaching our brains to be less distrustful, less focused on potential rejection.
Precisely. And there are also promising findings about the power of synchrony.
Synchrony.
Engaging in activities where we move in sync with others.
Give me an example.
Like dancing, singing, or team sports.
Interesting. Yeah. I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Something about how that shared rhythm, that physical connection, creates a sense of belonging.
Exactly. It taps into a primal part of our brains, reminding us that we're part of something larger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And those shared experiences can be incredibly powerful in combating loneliness.
So much to consider. It sounds like a multi-pronged approach is key.
It really is.
Addressing those negative thought patterns through therapy.
Right.
Actively seeking out opportunities for genuine connection.
Yes.
And maybe even adding some synchronized dancing into the mix.
I'd say that's a good recipe for a healthier, more connected brain.
And a reminder that loneliness isn't a weakness.
No.
It's a signal from our brain.
Right.
An evolutionary urge telling us to connect.
It is.
And the good news is we have the power to rewire those neural pathways.
Yeah.
To build stronger connections.
Yes.
And ultimately to live richer, more fulfilling lives.
Well said.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. Thanks for guiding us through it.
My pleasure.
And for you listening, what's one small step you can take today to nurture those vital social connections?
Yeah.
Remember, even a small step can make a world of difference.
Absolutely.
Until next time, stay curious.